Hola, ¿cómo estás? Oosh, this might not be a super long video tonight. As you can see by the title of this video, theoretically, I spent my day off, the hottest day of the year so far, making food for the project of Runcible Foods. So, to sort of bring some folks up to speed, Runcible Foods is a card game that I came up with years ago. I should probably just tell the whole story of the origin of Runcible Foods. So, I have a fondness for a series of online stories about teenage superheroes. There's an online series of stories about kids who are mutants becoming superheroes. And it's a shared universe. And there's a forum, an active online community of people who talk about this setting and the stories that the authors produce. And in one of those forums, there was a discussion ongoing about the webcomic Girl Genius. At the time, the story of Girl Genius had an event going on where the main guy of the story, this sort of sidekick to the main girl of the story, was trying to stage an event to distract the population. And so he staged a fight with another character, and he used his ultimate weapon, the hand-cranked runcible gun. So the hand-cranked runcible gun was it looked like a meat grinder or an old crank film camera. And it has a crank on the side, and the front of it launches out runcible spoons. And part of the debate that was ongoing in the forums of the group that I belong to about superheroes was whether or not a runcible spoon was as it was portrayed in the webcomic of Girl Genius. And it was interesting. It's a certain level of nerdy amusement to the idea of tracking down the history of the word runcible from its original nonsense use in a poem by, I believe it was Edward Lear. And so he used the term as a descriptor. It's a runcible spoon, a runcible hat, a runcible cat. And he uses that term in that way, but he deliberately never defines it and sort of resists other people trying to define it. But runcible as a word was so fascinating to linguists around that time that they wanted to give a meaning to it. And so one linguist tried to decide that a runcible spoon was a small pickle fork, which is essentially a spoon with tines on the front edge of it that you could use to get pickles out of a jar or something of that effect. So it is, in effect, this linguist decided that small sporks were in fact runcibles. And so in the comic, his hand-cranked runcible gun is launching little sporks. Everybody's arguing over whether or not that really classifies it as a runcible. That's something somebody else applied to the term. And so they're back and forth about it. And somebody said, somebody should create a superhero named Runcible. And I went, I'll write a piece of fan fiction about a superhero named Runcible. So I started with that idea. And people are like, what are the hero's powers going to be? Confusion? I went, it could be kind of a superpower to have no power other than to convince people you have powers that you don't have. I thought that would be amusingly funny. But when I sat down to write the story of Runcible, that's not where it started. And it didn't really go that far in that direction before the character decided it wanted to be something else different. So before I get into this, one of the things I have to preface with is at that time in my life was when I had sort of hit the worst part of my illness. So I used to weigh probably about 100 pounds more than I do right now, give or take. And around that time, about 4 or 5 months earlier, I had started to get sick. And when I mean like sick, like serious food poisoning style sick, but it never stopped. And I lost half of my body weight easily in 2 months. By 4 or 5 months into it, I'd lost more than 100 pounds, and it got pretty substantial to the point where I was not sure how long I had to make it. And part of that problem was my inability to eat or digest pretty much any food at all. I would eat something and immediately be violently ill until my system was empty again. And there were only a few foods that I could eat very rarely. So once or twice a day, I would eat a meal that was, and it was like, at one point I had decided like, okay, what have I not eaten in the last 8 months? Because it can't be what's causing symptoms if I haven't had it for 8 months. So I switched over to eating poached salmon, small pieces of poached salmon, and I think a third of a cup of steamed peas, like mushy peas. And that was what I ate every meal, every day, 1 or 2 meals a day for a month. And it did alleviate some of my symptoms of my illness, but it didn't solve it. I'd still get sick, but not as brutally bad as I was. But I was still losing weight pretty rapidly. A few months out from that point, I was able to eat carrots, peas, and fish with a little bit of honey for some of the calories and sweetness that I could get from it. But I was still losing weight. But that's to say, for a long period of time, my diet was literally 3 foods and only specific brands of those foods, because sometimes there would be something added to the fish or something added to the peas or carrots, maybe some butter or a hint of something else added to it, and it would set me off. So I went months just eating the same 3 foods every meal, every day. And after about a month and a half to 2 months of doing that, you sort of get to a point where food is just like taking a shower. It's just something you do each day. It's not a pleasurable experience. It's not an unpleasant experience. It's just something, it's part of the process of being alive. And so I wasn't really even bothered by that anymore. But it was interesting to note that around that time when I was doing some story writing, there was always some interesting novel exploration of food involved in my storytelling. And so back to the idea of the character of Runcible Superhero, the character I designed, they had essentially 2 powers. They had amnesia about who they were and where they came from. But the 2 powers that they had were, if they spoke nonsense words or any kind of similar thing, where if they made gibberish noises, whoever heard them speak them could only speak in nonsense words, and nobody else can understand them except for the hero themselves. So the character could speak, like, I think the opening scene, I had the character in bed being woken up for an appointment they had to go drive to. And so the character wakes up and just mumbles, and the person who woke them up for the rest of that morning is unable to speak anything other than gibberish. And it was fun to do as writing because you literally just wrote gibberish, but you had to know what the character meant because the hero can understand the gibberish as if it's just being spoken, but not consciously. If the hero Runcible is listening to somebody who's speaking gibberish, and they go like, oh, they're clearly speaking gibberish, but what do you think they mean? And Runcible could answer that question. And so that's one of the power sets. The other, and it comes from the fact, I really think just from the idea that the word runcible is a nonsense word. It's a modifier of other words, and what it does when it modifies that word, we can't really say. What is distinct between a regular hat and a runcible hat? We've modified it in some way, but we have no understanding of what that modification is. And so that's part of where that came from. The other half of Runcible's powers were the ability to assemble random pieces of garbage. So take a popsicle stick, a box cutter, and a bottle of hand sanitizer, and assemble them into weird devices that actually do things that they shouldn't be able to do. So slamming together some broken light bulb pieces, some pipe fittings, building I think I'm trying to remember all the pieces that went together, but the end result was a ray gun looking device of these pieces clumped together. They shouldn't go together and they shouldn't do anything once put together, but it did something. In this case, it fired a self-adhesive piece of pink vinyl at people's faces. So it's like slapping a giant sticker over somebody's face. That's what it did. But here's the thing. When Runcible assembles the pieces into this gun, they have no idea what it does. They know it's roughly a weapon, but it could make the threat bigger, make it a giant threat, could set it on fire or liquefy it. No idea what it does until they pull the trigger. And so that's the other power. It's just like random things should not go together. So like a spoon and a fork, they should not have a function. They should not be able to do anything, but it makes no sense. And again, it's that nonsense concept. And so I had this character that I built up around this idea of speaks gibberish, causes others to speak gibberish and not be understood, assembles things that shouldn't go together but end up working together to produce something that they shouldn't be able to produce. And they don't know how those powers work until they do. And so that was the character I built for the character of Runcible. But like I said, with my digestive ailment going on and my sort of unconscious playing around with food, I built the character to have a sort of quirk, a disadvantage, I guess. It's not really a disadvantage, but they're unable to tolerate normal food. So like ham and cheese on rye with mustard, they couldn't eat that. What they can eat is regular food items, not like Drano or anything like that. There is another character in the story who has those strange food modifiers that they eat Drano and steel wool. That's another character. But the character Runcible, their food has to be things that should not be mixed. So if you served corn chips and you wanted a dip for them, You could do salsa and guacamole for other people, but if Runcible is going to be eating food, the dip they're more likely to use is a puree of green olives and orange juice. Things that really shouldn't go together. You want to make a birthday cake for Runcible? Maybe do a cranberry mustard cake with a ranch icing. That's a Runcible cake. And having something for lunch, you would take an olive loaf, so like a bologna with olives and embedded in it, cut on thin slices. You take an olive loaf and you take marshmallow fluff and you make pinwheels out of them, and that's a Runcible food. You want to give Runcible some breakfast cereal? You could do something like Fruit Loops and Worcestershire sauce. Like really things that do not belong going together. And it was fun writing the character periodically having to have a lunch or breakfast and talking with other people who just can't with her food choices. Just sitting there across from Runcible and going like, is that a lima bean and gummy bear oatmeal cookie? Like, oh my God. No. And so I had a lot of fun making these scenes and coming up with a different food item for each of these scenes that is ghastly in nature. And I got playing with this idea of writing more of that character's story. At the time, I was working in a kitchen, which I should probably never be allowed to do because I'm prone to weird experimentation. Ask me about deep fried watermelon at some point. But I'm working in the kitchen, thinking up ideas for my character's story. I got into the habit of talking with some of my coworkers and trying to brainstorm new food choices. And it was sort of set up as a game where we'd walk around the kitchen and, okay, so like it was called Making Runcible Foods because it's food for the character Runcible. And so I walk around the kitchen and like the goal was either propose a food for others or have others propose a food to you. And now it's your job using only food ingredients that are common food ingredients, not like crickets or something like that. Using just those rules, common everyday food items, just combining them in ways they shouldn't go, can you figure out how to make an intolerable version of the food originally proposed by somebody? And I mean, it was so much fun to play this game, walking around the kitchen and have somebody propose a food item. Like, okay, let's see what you can do with a potato. Potato is actually pretty hard. It's a pretty neutral starch. So to ruin, it's not really ruining, but to ruin or make an unacceptable food combination for potato came a little difficult. Like something salty would work, something, you don't really do a lot of sweet, so you could maybe do something with a sweetness, like a honeyed potato, but that's not bad. It's just not usual. Most fatty things go well with a potato, so like sausage or gravies go well with potato. Like, what would you do? And the only thing I could really think of for like a potato was like coffee. Like if you made a mashed potato, but instead of using milk, you used coffee, that would be horrible. But I hate coffee. For somebody who loves coffee, it might be worth an experiment for them. And so playing with ideas like this, I had a blast. One of my favorites was the day I came in and we were doing a few of these things as we worked in the kitchen. It was really like drive-bys. You'd walk by somebody else's station in the kitchen and you'd go like, all right, what can you do with olives? and then you just leave them, and you give them a minute or two to try to figure something out. And when they walk past you in the kitchen, they say, I think I got it. Mix it with oranges. And so, like, one of the ones that was most impressive was somebody hit me with asparagus. How do you make asparagus a runcible food? And the thing is, like, if you do something sour, like a lemon juice or a vinegar, it works. If you salt asparagus, it works. If you do something like a honey, it works. There's really not a lot of options to, like, a bacon grease would work really well. So, like, what do you do? Like, if you add scallops to asparagus, it doesn't break it. Like, if you were to do a peanut butter sandwich and you add scallops to it, that's gross. But what do you do with asparagus? Like, you could probably get away with a peanut butter on asparagus. What would you do? Like, fish or vinegar or honey? Like, there are not a lot of options to really mess up asparagus. And so I'm like, oh man, that's a hard one. And that whole day, I'm playing around with this idea in the back of my head. And it wasn't until like my next day that I was working that I came in and I went, guys, I got it. And they go, you got what? I figured out how to make a runcible food out of asparagus. And I'm like, all right, let's hear it. Banana mint asparagus. I was like, oh, that's pretty bad. It's like, that was so much fun. I'm like, this is a fun game to play. It's a little sparse on like translation to, like, I can't sit down at a table at a family gathering with 8 other family members and just do that. I need to build some kind of rule system and other play methods. So I started to figure out, like, okay, what do I need to do to make an actual playable game from this? And so really the game starts out with the idea of, I just need to make a list of about 72 to 78 foods. And each one of those is a card. And so I built this game around this, and basically it's very similar to the game we played in the kitchen, where somebody proposes a food and the other people try to figure out how to make the worst combination. And that's the game that I created. Now, there's a more complicated rule system for it. It's not super complicated. It's actually a pretty simple game. But when I built this game, I wanted to do a playtest deck of cards for this. And when I did this, what I used at the time was basically, I built a list of foods that I thought made a good set of starting foods, with the idea that as we go further, I can make additional decks. So the base deck is about, I believe, 72 to 78 cards. And it's things like apples and artichokes and peaches and tomatoes and tuna fish and popcorn and strawberry jam. And those are all the cards. You got 72 of those cards. And you can play a game. I've play tested it with groups of people. You can play a game with usually minimum 3 people. I say usually because there's a caveat there. Usually minimum 3 people, upwards of 5 people. 5 people is the limit we sort of hit with that base deck, because you start reshuffling through the deck and you start running out of cards fast if you're using 5 people. But the solution is, if you had 2 decks, you could easily get up to 8 to 10 people playing before it's a problem. But if it's two cards of green beans instead of just 1, the odds that somebody has a hand with 2 green beans in it may screw up their ability to do much past just adding green beans to whatever's proposed as the food item. But there's a whole world of foods out there. And so I started to figure out, like, okay, the game itself, I want to call Runcible Foods: A Game in Bad Taste. because it's a game about bad tasting foods. So that's the idea. And the fun of it, the wordplay, goes back to the fact that runcible was a wordplay thing. It was a nonsense word. Yeah. Right. And that's like, it's so fun to goof around with stuff like that, that as you sit there and play with this game idea, I got to thinking like, okay, so with a little bit more of that wordplay, and I'm a fan of wordplay, and I'd already been working on a recipe book of good tasting recipes. Some of it based around the idea of making sauces. And I was going to call it alchemical saucery, because when you start with something like a ketchup and you can turn it into a barbecue sauce with just mixing it with a few other things, it's sort of like alchemy, where you're taking a lead and through the processes you apply to it, turning it into gold, taking one thing and converting it, transmuting it into something else through adding things. I was playing around with that idea, and I liked the idea of calling that recipe book Alchemical Saucery. But in the back of my head, hearing the term saucery instead of sorcery also triggered my brain going, well, that's a saucy idea. And I went like, oh, if I made a bonus deck for my Runcible Foods game, but it's entirely sauces, I should call it Let's Get Saucy, just because it's wordplay. And then I started to think like, okay, if we do a deck that's just a set of spices, so like the mint for the banana mint asparagus, it's usually more of an herb, but if you wanted to call it a spice, I could do something like cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, ginger, mustard, chili peppers, those types of things. Could be a small additional deck that you can load into the base deck. And I want to call that one Let's Spice Things Up. You could do an entire deck full of dairy products or cheeses and say, let's get cheesy. Again, with the wordplay. So I had a whole lot of fun with the idea of these additional decks. Let's get nuts. Let's get cheesy. Let's spice things up. Let's get saucy. And so each of those decks being somewhere in the range of like 18 cards as a bonus deck. So you have your base deck of 72, say, and then you add 18 to it. 18 cards is roughly what you'd need to add an extra player. So when you hit that limit of 5 players for the base deck, adding a bonus deck, say Let's Get Cheesy, gives you the ability to have 6 players at the table. And the number of bonus decks that I can build of 18 cards apiece are enough that if you just got bonus decks, if you bought all the bonus decks, it'll exceed the number of cards in the base deck, so that you could literally double the number of cards you have in the deck and play a group of 10 people at a family gathering of this game with just the base deck and the bonus decks. And so it's like, that's a fun game to play with people if you give them the chance. And so I started building up the artwork for the base deck to play test. And I just basically did a Google image search for each of the food items, took those images, did a little bit of editing for them, put some font on it to explain what they were, and that was my deck of cards using Google Images. That's not a viable product because of that, but it was a deck I could get printed and do play testing with people. Now, the simpler version of that would simply be to write the name of each of the foods on an individual card, no picture needed. And I may end up doing that as the free version you could download and play. But I wanted to use, again, I think we had the discussion once before about the idea that when I when I wanted to do images for this, I could hire somebody to take pictures of each of these food items and give them to me. But the rights to purchasing the rights to those images or using stock images for each of the foods could be a problem in the future at some point when I have to point out how I own the rights to these things because somebody wants to challenge me on that. Whereas if I literally just take the pictures myself, it's not a problem anymore. And so that's sort of what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks when I've had the ability to do it, is set up a piece of white poster board without a seam in it. So it's just curling around basically there's a closet door sort of like this one. And I put the poster board against that and let it slide down onto the floor. So it has that bend in it. So no seam is apparent. And without a seam in it, it doesn't, that's real careful about how you say that phrase. Without a seam, it doesn't leave any lines anywhere on the picture. And then in the foreground of that picture, on the lower edge of the white poster board, I put a bamboo cutting board. And then I've just been putting one of each of those food items on that cutting board and taking a picture of it with enough lighting from both sides of it so that it doesn't cast too aggressive of a shadow. And so I have these pictures of foods on a cutting board on a white background. And that makes it easy enough for me to trim the edges of those pictures close enough to the food that I can blend out the white so that all it is this little picture of the food on a cutting board in the middle of a card. I can put the font on it telling you what the food item is, specifically for things like feta cheese, tofu, and cream cheese. The ability to distinguish those on a white background gets hard. So you may not always know what strange white block you're looking at on a given picture. So having font to explain what it is helps. But aside from that, I'm most of the way through my list of pictures now. That may be slightly generous of me to say most of the way. I have to find alfalfa sprouts, or failing that, I'll use any sprout that I can find. I need to get another artichoke because the one I got is starting to not look like it's viable. I may need to find another eggplant. I don't know if that's really on my big list right now. It's a big list, so keeping track of what's on it is not as easy as one would imagine. So I've done cherries, and I found a nice pack of fresh cherries at the grocery store. I don't think eggplant's on here. All right. But I do need to get alfalfa, artichokes. We have some frozen blueberries. I kind of want to do fresh. Yeah, you can do some photo manipulation, but I think what I've got so far in the pictures that I have, they're pretty much ready to go. I mean, I don't have to edit them. I could literally just take all of my photographs, chunk them in on the card template for game crafters, and that would be all I would need to do. What I'm probably going to end up doing is I'm going to put them in. I'm going to take each of those pictures, drop them into, I think it's MS Paint, and then do in font underneath of them what they are, and then upload that picture to Game Crafters. And even if the picture's not the best picture, or not like a studio grade high quality picture, it's still a picture of the food. And that's all you need it to be. Yeah, I like to do in-camera editing when possible. That's basically, I don't have to use a special editing software to make it work. I may see if I can change the resolution. But I am debating also, I think I mentioned once before, there's a piece of software that you can use on the web. There's a site I went to where I can take a photograph and make it look like it's been painted. You're essentially applying a filter to it. You make it look like a painting or a cartoon. And people use this to design avatars for their social media. But if I take each one of these pictures of the food items that I've taken and run them through there and make them look like painted artwork rather than photographed artwork, I'm debating whether or not I'm going to do that, because it depends on how they look when I run them through the filter. But having them look painted could be a more fun thing to do. In the end, though, like having the photographs of the food on the front unaltered from the photographs that I took, that's fine. It'll work. It's a playable game. The backs of the cards, I do want to make it look like a painting, because I want it to look like the label for the brand of Runcible Foods. So it's almost like if you look at a jar of dressing or a can of something where it's got the decorative branding on the label, I want to be able to produce a branding label that talks about Runcible Foods, and that's going to be the back of all the cards. So making a back of a card like a painting is more ideal. I may see if I can apply that same filter to each of the individual food items, but I mean, we'll see where we go as we go along. The tricky ones are going to be like, does that effect ruin the visible texture and effects of a picture of broccoli? Like, if you run a picture of broccoli through those filters, does it make it an indeterminate green smear? And if it does, then I just won't use it for any of them. But I'll be curious to see what does and doesn't work for it. But that's what I've been doing all the last couple of weeks, is finding foods when they're harder to find. I still need to find a turnip and alfalfa sprouts. I probably won't be able to get a pumpkin, but I have a squash that looks decidedly like a pumpkin that I might be able to use. So I'm going to see if I can use that one. I can't remember any of the other ones that are going to be super hard. The other thing going on with this is some of this is things like rice. So I'm not going to prepare some rice for the picture and not use it. So I've been eating a lot of foods that I don't customarily eat. And some of them aren't always going great for me. Tonight's choice was probably, I'm hoping I don't regret it too much tomorrow. As I've been working on it today, like some of the things that I've had to eat were seasoned lima beans, cauliflower, broccoli, asparagus, and Brussels sprouts. I don't know about you, but my system is sufficiently sensitive enough that choosing to take pictures of and then eat beans, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, and broccoli and cauliflower, I am probably going to have a rough night. Hopefully not a super rough day tomorrow. Because I got to work tomorrow. We'll see how that turns out. But that's sort of what I've been doing most of the last few days. I have been brainstorming on other projects in the meantime, but I don't get a lot of anything to show. Okay, deep fried watermelon. When I was working in the kitchen, we had the deep fryers, and about once a week they'd stop them, let them cool down, and then drain them. So periodically there would be a point where at the end of the day, we would have these deep fryers that were still hot oil, but they were going to be cleaned out shortly anyway. So I knew that was coming up. Every Wednesday was when we did it. And I was in charge of prepping a lot of the fruit and salad bars during the day. So I went and when you cut up the melon to serve on, you get some slivers that are just an irregular piece. And I took those and I popped them in the refrigerator to let them sort of not drain, but dry out a little bit so that they weren't pure water. And I probably could have breaded them first or battered them and breaded them. But I chose to try to see if I could just deep fry those as they were. So I did watermelon, I did cantaloupe, and I did honeydew melon. And so I took my slices at the end of the night when they had just turned off the fryers. The oil was still up to frying temperature, going to gradually cool down. And I put them in. And the key thing was doing thin slices that had drained so they weren't mostly water. Because if you put thick slices or they still had a lot of water in them, they explode. So please don't ever do that. But with that in mind, the thin slices, when you put them into a hot oil, they get a texture similar to if you've ever pan fried in butter, like an onion. You slice some onion and you pan fry it and it gets translucent and soggy and floppy. That's what happens to the slices of melon. And they get that sort of like that amber hot oil fried color to some of them, but they don't really burn, they don't crisp, but they do have a sort of a chewiness to them. And of the three, honeydew, if I remember correctly, honeydew tasted really, really good, because I think a lot of the sugars in the melons caramelize a little bit. So you have this caramelized, soft, chewy, sweet melon piece, which is really good. Cantaloupe, however, has a little bit of a muskiness to it when you eat it raw. When you fry it, that flavor is accented aggressively. And so it really has a weird aftertaste that's not super great. Watermelon is closer to the honeydew. I think honeydew is a little bit better because it's a sweeter melon, but watermelon has a nice sweetness and a caramelization that happens. So it's like a little bit of a hint of watermelon with a caramel tone to it. And it's that chewy sort of dried apple or fried onion texture. I know that the description of taking onion and watermelon together sounds like a runcible food by itself, but I do think there is a part of me that if I could figure out a way to get cubes of watermelon to drain properly so that they're not going to be explosive, and then maybe doing a light breadcrumb to the outside of it before deep frying it, I think that would be actually really tasty. I can almost see, you might be able to do it instead of doing a breadcrumb. I might see if I could do like a batter, like a funnel cake batter. Dip it in that, fry it, and sprinkle it with a little bit of powdered sugar. I feel like the real trick to that is draining the juices out of it. You might have to put it in the dryer, like a food dryer first, to just remove some of the water content. Condense the juices a little bit into almost like a syrup inside of it. If you can, I don't think you want to freeze dry it. I think that's the wrong way to go. But I think if you could get it a little bit drier, but not fully dry, batter coat it and then fry it that way, I think that would be, I could see that being a great little snack. I'd do it with honeydew, and I would probably do it with watermelon. I never got to try pineapple. I think pineapple would be okay. I'm thinking of like a cooked pineapple can be really decent. Because that's essentially what you end up doing, is you're basically doing the same thing as if you put it on a nonstick tray, baked it in the oven, and then drizzled oil over top of it. You're doing something similar to that. The higher heat of the oil tends to give it a little more caramel on the outside, caramelization on the outside, and the fat from the oil kind of soaking into it just a little bit gives it a soft chewiness that you maybe wouldn't get from a baking. But yeah, I would totally do that again. I also deep fried origami. So we had little slips of paper. I would fold some of those up into paper cranes and drop them in the fryer, and they'd become translucent because the oil on paper pattern just becomes translucent. But it also crisps the paper up a little bit, so it becomes more brittle as it sets up. Yeah, so I do a lot of weird things in a kitchen. I'd be curious to see if you could do a grape, but I think grapes are just entirely too much water content. Because if you try to take a grape and dry it out, you just get a raisin, and I don't know that like deep fried raisin adds anything to it. Yeah, I mean, I'd do a lot of weird things if I had a lot of equipment to play around with. I can remember a conversation with one of my aunts. She got one of those soda stream things where you could carbonate drinks with it. And that's a weird gesture for that. But so you put liquids into it and you pull a lever and it injects carbon dioxide into the liquid and makes it a carbonated drink. And so she was showing this off to family at a family gathering. I go, well, I should definitely never get one of those. And she goes, why not? And I go, because probably the first thing I would do with it is see if you can carbonate mustard. It's like, that's literally the first thing that popped into my head. And if I had access to one, I'd probably try it relatively quickly. And so, like, yeah, I would play with a lot of weird things if given the chance. Yeah, I'm a weirdo when it comes to playing with food. And some of that comes from, like, I have a lot of family who are well known for, like, my mom used to be the head of the kitchen at a bed and breakfast. They used to own it. Actually, an inn they used to own. It wasn't really a bed and breakfast. But so, like, I grew up with somebody who knew how to professionally cook. And our family has a whole slew of recipes that they share back and forth. So I was exposed to that from an early age. So, like, I have a little bit of a background in it without really knowing I had a background in it. I always just consider that, like, yeah, I know how to cook, like, eggs Benedict. I made it every day for like a month at one point while I was in high school. I was just making myself breakfast. I made eggs Benedict. Like, it never really occurred to me that other people didn't eat that way. Like, they didn't learn how to cook stuff like that when they were younger. Deviled eggs. There was a time where I made deviled eggs. Like, I'd take 3 eggs and I'd make like the 6 halved deviled eggs as a snack when I got home from school. But I was never really, like, highly focused on pursuing some of that. But back when I got sick and I only ate the same foods every day, like, I really enjoyed experimenting with creating new and interesting foods and letting other people try them and getting that kind of enjoyment of other people's enjoyment of food from doing that. And so I did that for a good long while, like cheesecake filled donut holes dipped in dark chocolate and sprinkled with freeze dried strawberry. I've made peppermint marshmallow crispy treats. I've made apple spice crispy treats, which is a Rice Krispie treat, but instead of using just plain marshmallow, using an apple, cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg flavored marshmallow mix. And the end result was something that has a flavor of like an apple pie or an apple crisp, but it's a dry marshmallow crispy treat that you can eat. And I loved exploring and experimenting with those things. I've done a few other experiments with other food items. I did some in my cooking show where I did the some of the different sauces and marinades and condiments. When I made those, some of that was just taking a look around, see what people made, and improvising a new way of doing something like that. So yeah, I mean, I play with foods a lot more since I have a more restricted diet. Unfortunately, with the things I'm taking pictures of for runcible foods, some of them, like, I'm not going to let them go to waste. So things I ate today are a can of sardines, sauerkraut, seasoned lima beans, a can of cranberries, like whole cranberries for making cranberry relish. And I sort of made some runcible foods tonight. I don't think anybody ever goes like, yeah, let's have, sauerkraut, sardines, and cranberries. They don't really go great together. But it wasn't super bad. So, but my digestive system is a little angry at me today. It's one of those things. I was a little late getting on here tonight, partly because my system goes like, you're not off the hook yet. Alrighty, so I think that's probably good for tonight. I will pop back in. I'm going to try for tomorrow. And if it has to be tomorrow, it will be a short video. And I may do it before this time and just have something posted. I might, if it feels like I'm going to be exhausted tomorrow and probably going to hit bed early, I'll still post something before I go to bed. You just may hop on and catch it as something that went up hours before. Don't worry about it. I'm not super worried that might happen. But I'm going to aim for doing 11:30 otherwise. So either way, around this time tomorrow, there should be a video up. And then hopefully by, Thursday, I will be able to sit down and do a more in-depth video. This is run kind of long tonight. But yeah, I'm hoping to get into the pattern of being able to do videos, if not nightly, at least regularly again. I don't always have full claim of my life, and I do know that Friday night might be a little tricky. The landlord's trying to rent out a neighboring room again, and so I'm sort of property manager, so I have to do a lot of interviewing and showing the space around, and he's got somebody scheduled for Friday night, so it's going to be a chunk of my Friday involved in that process. And then I don't know, it should be done before 10 p.m. So I should be able to come on here after that. But whether or not I'm able to get that done and then some of my own stuff done, eat, and still be functional enough to do a video by the end of the night, I don't know. We'll have to see. Hopefully it's not too disruptive to my attempts to get back onto a regular schedule of uploading. But until then, I should probably have cut it about 15 minutes ago. But we'll go with take care and have a good night. Man, it's been hot. I hope it's not this hot for the rest of the week. It's super hot right here, right now. I think it's like 90, 92. I'm not up for a few days of that. It's way too hot for late May. Hopefully you're doing all right. I may have to turn the AC on tomorrow, but we'll see. If I do, I'll turn it off for the audio and I do a video. Bye-bye.